You know, it's no secret that the United States has been the most powerful military force in human history for the last several decades. When it comes to the might and the power of the U.S. military, that is extremely well documented, and hardly anybody would question it, and even fewer people would actually want to mess with it and put it to the test. But there is a problem with U.S. military power that over the past several weeks, literally just the past several weeks, has caused it to decrease drastically in a way that might not be recoverable for several years, if not several decades. And that's because the American population and the American government has forgotten one of the key pillars of their military power, has neglected it, and in fact has undermined it, and now the rest of the world is turning their back on it. That's what I want to talk about in today's video, and what I'm talking about is the U.S. arms trade. Over the past several weeks, the United States has begun to lose some of the most important pieces of its arms trade, as nations who historically have purchased their weapons from the United States are now actively looking for other alternatives. And there have even been some canceled contracts, in particular around the American F-35. And the reason this is happening shows us that what we are seeing now is probably not the end of this trend, but actually the beginning. What is going on is that ever since the United States overnight stopped military aid to Ukraine and shut off Ukrainian access to certain systems and to U.S. intelligence, other nations have immediately begun looking for alternatives to American weapons. And this is because of their concerns that if they are overly reliant on the United States for their own national defense, the United States could, at the drop of a hat, just completely change its stance and go in a different direction. Now, in the case of Ukraine, the United States resumed military aid and they resumed military intelligence sharing very shortly after they stopped it, which makes the move on the surface seem rather pointless. But that being said, the damage was already done. Because the concern of these other nations who historically have purchased from the United States wasn't so much just the mere fact that the United States decided to stop sending weapons to Ukraine and stop sending intelligence to Ukraine, but it was the fact that the United States did this very abruptly, with no warning, basically at the flip of a hat. And because the United States made this decision on its own, without consulting the other nation that was relying on their weapons, Ukraine had some very catastrophic battlefield losses. That obviously makes other nations very concerned, and in particular when it comes to the F-35, because it relies on U.S. software. The concern is that if these nations are in a conflict or at war that the United States just doesn't agree with, even though they are sovereign nations, the United States can intervene, and using that software that they own and they control can cut off these nations' access to vital weapons. And so what we are seeing now is a wholesale move away from U.S. technologies very quickly, particularly high-tech U.S. technologies, where the U.S. can control outcomes unilaterally. Now, this is a major problem for the United States, and it goes very far beyond just lost weapon sales profits. In fact, that is probably the least important piece of all of this. It actually means a diminishing overall of America's global power and America's global influence. And that's what I want to talk about and explain in today's video. Now, really quickly, guys, as you might have guessed, given the nature of my content, internet security and privacy is something that is very important to both me and my family. It is a scary world that we live in, and that is why I have a multi-layered approach to my own internet security and privacy. And a big part of my internet security plan is a VPN, like Private Internet Access, the sponsor of today's video. Now, if you're not familiar with what a VPN does, normally when you're browsing the internet on an unsecured device, whether that's your phone or tablet or anything else, you are producing a lot of information that can be intercepted by bad actors. And what a VPN does is it encrypts that information so that even if it is intercepted, it is unreadable and unusable. Now, even more than that, a VPN can also mask your location, giving you enhanced privacy. But that doesn't just give you privacy, it also helps unlock certain things for you. So, for example, for me, when I'm browsing the news, it helps to connect to servers in other countries because then different articles pop up that don't normally pop up when I'm researching from the United States. And for the average person, that can also help you, for example, if you're wanting to access a Netflix catalog from the United States if you live outside of the US, or vice versa. Now, as far as VPNs, the reason I personally like private internet access more than others is that it has a wide range of servers, covering 91 countries and all 50 US states, and it has a no logs policy, meaning that they aren't logging your personal data, and that's been proven multiple times in court. Private internet access covers unlimited devices on just one subscription. So just one subscription covers the whole family, computers, phones, everything, and it comes at a very low cost, as low as just $2.03 per month. And if that sounds like something you're interested in, you can actually get an 83% discount on private internet access, as well as an extra 4 months for free when you subscribe using the link in the description of this video. So be sure to check that out, scan the QR code on screen, or visit the link in the description. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about why arms sales are so important, particularly for the country that is selling the weapons. So when it comes to warfare, a lot of people will say that the best war is the one that you never have to fight in the first place. And that is absolutely true. If you can win a war before you even fight it, or if you can prevent the situations that will lead to a war before they ever happen, that is the best possible thing that you can do. For a long time, powerful nations have understood this, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, and also modern-day Russia. And because of this, they have sought to keep other nations within their sphere of influence to prevent other nations from wanting to fight them in the first place if a global conflict ever broke out. There's a lot of ways that these countries do this. Today we're focused on the arms trade, and the arms trade is a major way to make this happen. Because if you think about it, if another country is dependent on you for further deliveries of the weapon systems that their soldiers are trained on, if that country is also dependent on you for things like spare parts, ammunition, support personnel, all sorts of different things, you can basically guarantee that if a global conflict ever breaks out, that country will either be on your side or they will stay neutral. They certainly will not fight against you because it would be too risky for them. However, for all these reasons, these dependencies that are created for the country that is purchasing the arms creates a lot of risk for them. And there are really only two reasons that countries are willing to take on this risk. The first, and largely in the case of the Soviet Union and Russia, is the fact that these are the only high enough quality weapons that they can afford to purchase. And the Soviet Union and Russia have taken advantage of that for a long time to sell weapons to the third world, not necessarily just because these countries trusted Russia, but because they were their only option. The second reason you would allow yourself to get in a dependent relationship, especially in the case of the United States, where the technology is not cheap, but it's actually incredibly expensive, is because you trust the other nation. For the United States, what this trust effectively means is that they will never have to fight a major war on their own territory. Because if major powers ever decide to go to battle, they will usually do so in other theaters of the world. The major wars will happen in Europe or in Asia, for example, but it will never come home to the United States. And so this trust is not just beneficial to the United States in keeping our own people directly out of war, but it also helps prevent wars from happening in the first place because so many countries exist under our security blanket if it is working appropriately. Now, this trust and the benefits that can be gained on the back end of it, both tangible and intangible, and let's be clear, the tangible benefits are very tangible. I'll explain those in a minute. This trust and the benefits that can be brought from it are the reason the United States, for so many decades, has invested in a foreign policy that focuses on them being a good partner to other nations. This isn't always just about giving stuff away or being a good country. There's some of that involved, but the United States gets a lot of benefits on the back end of it. However, unfortunately, in U.S. domestic politics, when these foreign policies are talked about, people don't understand the benefits. People only understand the costs. That could be, for most people, because they've never taken the time to give the benefit of the doubt and think that the United States actually is pursuing its policies for a good reason. Most people look at dollar signs that go towards foreign aid and building these helpful relationships, and they just see the cost, and oftentimes they even see corruption. Now, that attitude in particular is what we are seeing being championed by the current U.S. presidential administration. And that is what is leading to this predicament. The current U.S. presidential administration is saying America first in a way that is increasingly being interpreted, and maybe fairly so, as America only. And in an America-only world, while we can shed the costs, we also shed the benefits with the costs. And that's what we see with the arms trade, as so many countries are already turning away from us. Now, that brings us to a second benefit of the arms trade, and a major way that the U.S. is destroying its own global power, or has already destroyed a huge chunk of its own global power, by creating the set of conditions that is leading other countries to abandon us. That has to do with the actual cost of weapons production. If you think of all countries in the world as basically companies, just for the sake of illustration, one of the main reasons that the United States is the one that sells the weapons is because they are the company, the country, with the best technology. But how did the United States actually get to the point where they have the best technology? Well, they invested a lot in research and development. They had huge military budgets that obviously other countries can't keep up with. But how does the U.S. fund a lot of this research and development? Well, like any other country or any other company, the more units of a product that you can sell, the more you can offset the initial cost of the research and development. If you spend $1 billion creating a weapon and you only create one of them, that weapon costs $1 billion. But if you spend $1 billion researching and developing a weapon and you sell 50 of them, each of those units now costs only $20 million. And this is sort of the approach the U.S. has taken. We will be the country that puts tons of money into research and development, and we will have other countries within our sphere of influence that we sell the individual units to, so that we can sell a lot more units, produce a lot more units than we need for our own purposes, and therefore offset the cost of production on our own end as well. Because this helps make development costs comparatively cheaper, the U.S. can invest a lot more in development, and it allows us to have the best weapons on the planet in a lot of categories. But as that starts to go away, as countries start to look to other suppliers because they think the United States is less reliable, not only do they lose out on having U.S. weapons, not only does the United States lose out on having customers, but everybody across this entire sphere of influence now weakens their competitive advantage where they could have a technological edge. They are making it more expensive for not just the United States, but also for Western countries to develop further advanced technology, while, for example, China will just be able to keep going as it is. And this actually, if it happens long enough and on a big enough scale, gives China a chance to leapfrog U.S. and Western capabilities in a way that is very concerning. Now, the scales at which we're talking are not insignificant at all. Currently, U.S. arms sales amount to around 250 billion US dollars per year, which is close to around a third of the total U.S. annual military budget of around 850 billion US dollars per year. And when you think of the U.S. military as sort of a startup that is taking a lot of the money that is being put into it and researching and developing weapons that they can then sell to other countries at a higher cost over time, you actually see that a very large percentage of the U.S. military budget is offset by these foreign arms sales. Again, around a third. This scale is huge. In comparison, and very ironically, when you look at the war in Ukraine and the sum and total of U.S. military aid to Ukraine, that is only around 110 billion US dollars over the course of 3 years. And it's not even that much, because the way that that aid works is that the US sends Ukraine the old versions of units that they were already going to pay to replace, and they just replace the unit and send Ukraine the old one. So the $110 billion that we've sent is just the dollar value of the new units, and not actually the dollar value of what we actually sent to Ukraine. Now, part of the reason that the U.S. is losing its influence is because it was so impatient that it was sending so much money to Ukraine over the course of 3 years, $110 billion, that they have now sacrificed annual revenues 2.5 times larger than the total of what they have sent to Ukraine. This is stepping over dollars to pick up pennies, and it actually gets a little bit worse. When you look at the total U.S. military budget, again, currently annually around 850 billion US dollars per year, that is a massive amount of money. And why does that military budget exist? Well, it is largely to counter two main geopolitical opponents, one being Russia and one being China. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian military has held the Russian military at bay for a cost to the United States that has been around 1/8 of their annual military budget, and that has been over the course of over 3 years. So if the United States wants to truly save money on military expenditures, the best way to do that is actually to support Ukraine, continue to defeat the Russian military at a price that costs them pennies on the dollar, and also at the same time continue to support, and in that case actually expand, the arms trade that made people so willing to be in their sphere of the world in the first place. Now, what I always find super ironic about all of this is that in the United States, a lot of the discussion in the popular sphere about whether or not to support Ukraine has been wrapped up in conspiracy theories about how the military-industrial complex just wants to continue the war in Ukraine because it's making so much money by doing it. But the irony is that when you actually lay out all these facts, you realize that if there were a conspiracy, the military-industrial complex actually stands to lose a whole lot more than they stand to gain by the United States supporting Ukraine. Now, I'm not necessarily saying I buy into that. One thing I don't like about conspiracy theories is people just throw out incentives, but there's no evidence behind them. But if you are going to have a proclivity towards conspiracy theories, this is actually how the incentives line up. There is 850 billion US dollars a year at risk if the world realizes that it's actually far cheaper to support Ukraine and defeat Russia than US military budgets might suggest. And maybe the United States doesn't actually need to spend that much money in order to keep its military strong. Now, all of this is why it's so important to actually find all of the facts before drawing conclusions, especially if you live where I live and the media operates the way that US media operates. That is a big reason that I have created this channel, to get the actual facts in the hands of more people so that they can have conversations that, frankly, we just don't have enough in my country. Now, if you think that's important, if you enjoy what I do on this channel, you can support my work if you want to by becoming a patron. And patrons just help ensure that I can film more of these videos more often and hopefully at a higher quality as well. You can learn more about that by scanning the QR code on screen or following the link in the description of this video. Other than that, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next video.